Hi, this is Darlene Love, and you're listening to Icon Fetch.
Welcome to Icon Fetch, the web's premier music interview show. Now, here's your host, Tony Peters.
It's my party and I'll cry if I want to, cry if I want to, cry if I want to. You would cry too if it happened to you.
Welcome to the show. I am Tony Peters. Now, Lesley Gore was one of the most influential singers of the 1960s, knocking down doors for women performers for generations to come, all the while having a huge string of hits, beginning with It's My Party, then Judy's Turn to Cry, She's a Fool, and You Don't Own Me, among many more. Now, Lesley paved the way for artists like Taylor Swift, females who were writing and recording their own music. And Lesley stayed popular even as the Beatles were invading America, a testament to her tenacity. Unbelievably, there has never been a proper biography on Lesley's life and musical significance until now. Trevor Tolliver, longtime fan, became friends with Lesley toward the end of her life, and he has written You Don't Own Me, The Life and Times of Lesley Gore from Backbeat Books. So we welcome in Trevor Tolliver. How are you, man?
I'm doing very well, thanks. How are you doing?
Good. Now, you have been, in the introduction to your book, you talk about how you were, I've always been a big fan of Lesley Gore's music. So what was it about her music that stood out? Because you mentioned, I mean, you're in your 30s, so you weren't able to experience Lesley's music sort of firsthand. So how did that all come about for you becoming a fan?
Yeah, my parents graduated high school in the mid-50s and early 60s, and this wonderful period of music in between there is what they carried with them into their adulthood. And so that was the only music that was played in my home. It was the only music I ever knew. And there was just something about her voice out of all of them that just really struck a chord with me. As young as 5 years old, I remember exactly where I was and what I was doing the first time I heard It's My Party. It just made such an impression, and I don't know if it was just the clarity of her voice or just that sing-song quality of her music that was easy for a child to just kind of grab onto and run with. But there was just something that resonated right off the bat. And it's funny, as an adult, seeing the same thing happen with my own children. When we adopted our 4 boys, our youngest wasn't able to speak, even by 3 years old, and we were very concerned. And everyone we met prior to adopting the boys was kind of warning us, he may not ever speak. And we just started playing this music around the house, and there was something about her voice that struck a chord with him. And because of It's My Party, he started talking. And party was actually his first word, so we knew exactly what he wanted when he started talking.
Nice.
So there's just something about that voice that's just so appealing and instantly recognizable. And it's just funny, the same thing that struck a chord with me, I can see it in my own children as well.
Yeah, that's great, and you're able to kind of pass that on to another generation. Why do you think it's taken so long for Lesley Gore's story to finally be told?
I think there's just something about women in rock that just they never quite deserved the recognition that they should have had all along. It was many, many years before Connie Francis even had a book written about her, and she had to do it herself. And that was, a good 20 years after she was already making these huge, huge hits and became one of the biggest voices of the 50s. But I think it's easy just to sort of clump all the girls together into the girl group sound and call it a day, even though they were making tremendous strides as individual artists. And I think just her star started to fade in the 70s, and although she was doing the nostalgia circuits and a very prolific songwriter and writing songs for other people, I think it was just easy to ignore her unless you were one of the diehard fans that were really following her. And I was frustrated in my 20s. I kept looking for a book about her. You run to Amazon and you can find anything you want about anybody you want. And I just got basically tired of waiting, so decided to piece something together, really just kind of for myself. And as I started to score some more interviews and compile more information, I got to thinking, well, here's something that I have that I can share with other people that doesn't exist. So that's really how it kind of came to be.
Nice. Now, with any kind of book like this, you have to do some detective work. And from what I understand, you were able to meet Lesley a couple of times just kind of as a fan. But then towards the end of her life, you were actually able to call her a friend and actually the two of you actually had some correspondence. Like how was that able to come about?
By the end of 2013, I'd actually had a complete draft of the book finished, so I sent her a draft just to see if she wanted to participate in the project and get her thoughts on it. And she was very respectful and very sweet, and she was just starting her own memoir at the time. And so she was going to focus on her project and wished me well. But instead of ending it there, she continued to email, and we had this wonderful correspondence during that last year. And it was funny. She would kind of drop little clues and little hints and stories, and I thought, ooh, that's going to be great for the book. And then towards the end, I realized she didn't have to do that. She was doing that to sort of help me along, so she hadn't completely shut the door in my face. And a very, very sweet gesture that I realized in hindsight that was a very kind and unnecessary thing that she was doing. And that's really kind of how the friendship came about. And through that, I was able to interview some other people. She was reluctant to talk herself because of her own project, and she had periods of relative shyness throughout her career. But people around her also were very respectful for privacy, and kind of I had to knock on quite a few doors to get people to talk to me. But in some ways, she made it very, very easy.
Well, when you're putting a book together like this and you've got all these different sources, was there one that was kind of an aha moment for you of like, wow, you stumbled across somebody that really gave you a lot of insight?
The most surprising person I spoke to, and the one I was most terrified to speak to, actually was her mother.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, but before Lesley passed, I tried to avoid her family because I figured, well, she's writing her own memoirs. They're going to respect her privacy and let her do her own thing. And after she passed, I just kind of worked up the nerve to seek out her mom and give a phone call. And I thought, the worst case scenario, she just says no, and I'll never bother her again, or she might want to talk. And I had this sense when I spoke to her that maybe people weren't speaking to her and maybe were afraid to just because she had lost her child. And she was so eager to talk and very, very sweet and shared tons of stories. And as scared to death as I was to reach out and possibly offend her or feel like I was intruding on her grief, she was very, very welcoming. And we actually enjoyed a couple of really warm and lengthy phone calls, and she was such a joy to speak with.
That's fantastic. And if we go back to the beginning of Lesley's career, you talk about her parents, I've read a lot of these kind of biographies, and a lot of entertainers, when they're starting out, their parents are like, we're not really, we want you to be, have a steady, more, solid, a career kind of thing, and the entertainment business can be anything but that. But yet, I mean, as you kind of find out, Lesley's parents were definitely supportive.
Yeah, they really were, and they weren't musical people themselves, which is sort of another odd little twist. They just had a wonderful record collection, and that seemed to be all it took to influence Lesley, just like Lesley's music influenced so many people just as easily as putting down a record. But they were very reluctant about her career. She was very much a product of the 50s, and they wanted her to get married and find a nice man and settle down in the suburbs, and that was that. But as sort of a caveat to that, she did promise them that she would go to college. That was important to her anyway. So she did have that plan to fall back on. So in the meantime, I think that made it a little bit easier for her just to kind of to grab the success and run with it and enjoy it as long as she could.
Her first big song, It's My Party.
It's my party and I'll cry if I want to, cry if I want to, cry if I want to.
You talk a lot about that. There was a lot of aspects. It feel like you could almost write a whole book on just It's My Party because there was all these different things going on. We might never have heard of Lesley Gore had Quincy Jones, her producer, not ran into Phil Spector at Carnegie Hall. That sort of chance meeting sort of was pretty fortuitous, I think, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's My Party had been sort of promised to the label, but they found out sort of at the 0 hour that the promise they were given was broken, and this exclusive song that they had actually been given to several other artists. And Phil Spector's girl groups at the time, like the Crystals and the Ronettes, were having enormous hits. And the Crystals had just recorded their own version of the song at the same time that Lesley had recorded hers. So when Quincy found that out, he ran home and grabbed engineer Phil Ramone, basically plucked him out of bed in the middle of the night, made as many copies of the song as they could, and had him sent out to radio stations the next morning. So it really was a race against the clock. It was a period of within 24 hours that Leslie's career could have died before it even got started.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing. And you mentioned Quincy Jones. I mean, that was kind of a surprise for me. I didn't realize that Quincy was the producer on all of her big early hits. And in a way, Lesley kind of opened the door for Quincy as well. I mean, he had been doing some other things, but I mean, is it safe to say that was probably his biggest success at that point?
Oh, absolutely. He was relatively new at the label himself, being promoted to a pretty big position. And he had a fine ear for what was going on around him. And Mercury had been a pretty adult label and doing jazz numbers and other sort of adult fare like that. Well, he was looking around at rival companies and saw that they were releasing records by the Everly Brothers and Connie Francis and all these other younger artists, and he saw where the money was, and he saw where kids were flocking to and knew that they were going to be the ones buying up these records. And he took a chance on Lesley. Other producers around the label had passed on her, but there was something in her voice, again, something that just struck with him immediately. And they took sort of each other under each other's wings, and together they just launched hit after hit throughout the 60s. And like you mentioned earlier, she was one of the few solo American acts, and a female to boot, that was able to kind of best them and hold her own among that the new scene.
Right, yeah, you mentioned that. The Beatles come along. It's My Party was released like in May of 63 or so, and then the Beatles come along the next winter in 64, and yet Lesley was, it's been well documented. The Beatles pretty much wiped out a lot of these American artists from the charts, and yet Lesley stuck around. And I mean, is there any, is that just sort of her tenacity, or is something about her songs connecting with the listeners that maybe other songs didn't?
Yeah, I think she developed a really, really strong and loyal fan base very early on, because there just wasn't anyone doing what she was doing with the talent that she brought to it. And I think just between the combination of her talent, her fans, and being paired with some of the best songwriters of the day, she was just given some fantastic material that even after the Beatles came along, her songs were still resonating. You almost couldn't help it. They were so infectious. And so I think she was a great powerhouse to kind of go up against them, and a very unlikely, I don't want to say adversary, but a very unlikely keeper of the flame for American acts was this tiny, solo teenage girl.
Right, absolutely. And one of the things you reveal in there is that she was not too keen on one of her biggest songs, "She's a Fool."
She's a fool. She's a fool.
What did she have a problem with that song with?
She very early on, she got sort of pigeonholed into this role, and that was the sort of the whiny girl who had to find happiness at the whim of a boy, always sort of left alone, always even abused in a lot of this material. And I think when You Don't Own Me came along, she found something like, okay, good, this can kind of break that open. This will give me a wider range, give me access to different material than what I've been used to. And I think those songs just sort of reinforced an image that she really wasn't comfortable with, or felt that, okay, I did this, but I want to grow up a little bit here. But they found very comfortable territory for her in which to sort of remain. And so there were trade-offs where she would record a few songs that Quincy knew would be hits, and in exchange, she would get to record a few jazz standards or lullabies or some other things that were much more important and personal to her. But she still delivered the lyrics of those songs with honesty and sincerity, because she was a teenage girl herself among teenage fans, so she could feel what the records were saying. And I don't think fans really put much thought into it. If it was just a good song and they could connect with it, then that's all they really needed. But she was definitely squirming under the pressure of the songs like She's a Fool and Maybe I Know, where she just kind of had to go along with these cruel boyfriends.
Right. And you mentioned You Don't Own Me.
You don't own me. I'm not just one of your many toys.
I mean, it's the title of the book, and it's arguably her most important song, because women were just not recording songs like that.
Absolutely, and that could have gone either way. It was either going to be really, really big, or it was going to be the thing that maybe was the first nail in the coffin of her career. Because, like you said, that wasn't the attitude then. Girls weren't shaking their fingers in the faces of boys, and it was such a bold statement to make, especially for a 17-year-old girl. And even now, 40, 50 years after it was recorded, that and probably I Will Survive are the two greatest anthems that you hear anywhere and everywhere when it comes to the voice of empowerment. So she was onto something. She heard that song, fell in love with it, and ran with it to Quincy and said, look, I want this. I'm going to make this mine. And she did. It's been covered multiple times, but just nothing with the power that she put into it.
Right. One of the things that Lesley was a part of was the Tammy Show. And, I mean, I encourage anybody to see that. Now it's available on DVD. And, I mean, this is just a great snapshot in time because you have British and American artists on the same stage. You know, you got the Beach Boys, you got the Stones, you got James Brown, you got Marvin Gaye, you got all this, and then you have Lesley Gore. And I almost feel like watching that footage, she gets the best response. I mean, people are going nuts for her.
She did, and she was really sort of the headliner of that entire concert, because you look at some of the other groups who are legendary now, they were just sort of getting started in America. A lot of those British acts were brand new. Some of the other American acts she was with, like the Beatles, with the Beach Boys, hadn't quite made tracks in the water just yet. They were still picking up steam. And so she was the biggest headliner at the time. She was really the one that they went to go see. Her name was featured most prominently. Her picture was used most prominently in some of the advertising that I'd seen from back in the day. So she was definitely the draw.
And you talked about, some of as her career went along, she started to get more material that was more adult. And really, I mean, I had a chance to go back and listen to California Nights.
California night, when I'm walking with you, hand in hand by the shore, yeah.
I mean, what a great sort of like masterpiece that was.
Absolutely. She had Quincy Jones by then had left the label. He was moving on to bigger and better things. And so there was a period in the late 60s during her last few years with Mercury where she was being run through a series of different producers. And that was the first time she had worked with Bob Crewe, and he just had this amazing ear for sound and layering music. And if you listen to the background of that song, there's so much happening, and he just created these wonderful sort of auditory murals in which her voice was overlaid. And you recognize that sound in other songs that she did with him, and she ended up going to his label in the 1970s. But that was one of the best examples of some of the other things that producers were doing to keep her alive during the 60s.
Now, her career eventually kind of, dwindled down, the success. But one of the interesting things is she chose to keep a promise to her parents and go to college. And so she was still, performing, and she was going to college. In your research, if she had just stuck with entertainment, could the career have lasted a little longer? Do you think the entertainment side of things suffered at all as a result of her schooling?
She may have weathered it maybe a little bit longer. Going to college definitely did take some of the momentum out of what she was doing, because she put her education ahead of everything else. I don't think that was a huge part of what happened. I think the musical scene was just changing so rapidly that little frothy pop that she'd been used to doing in the early 60s just wasn't cutting it by the late 60s, when you had the counterculture in Vietnam, a very, very intense and uncomfortable period, and the music of Lesley Gore just didn't seem to fit in that. I mean, just within a few years of her first hit, she already seemed like this product of a very, very different time. So I think a lot of it was timing more than education. And she fought like crazy to stay relevant. She worked with a series of different producers and sampled a whole bunch of different styles and sounds to try and stay relevant. But I think her name had just become synonymous with the jukeboxes and the record hops and the tail fins. Just within years of her becoming a hit.
Right. And imagine being in your early 20s and you've already peaked. That's
yeah. There's this this dichotomy between, like, when she graduated from college, here she was among all these peers who were just starting their lives, and here, the greatest things were already behind her.
Yeah, unbelievable. And I mean, she continued to record, and very important is that, she started to gain more artistic control, and she started to write the music that she wanted to record and that kind of stuff. A lot of people don't know a lot of her music, post all the hits. If you were to point to one particular album for people to go, kind of explore of this sort of latter day stuff, what would you say?
I would recommend Someplace Else Now, which was released in the early 1970s, and it's all music that she had written with a friend of hers named Ellen Weston. And I think that album is probably the truest to her. The Mercury recordings of the 60s were very glossy and heavily orchestrated, and this just is stripped down to very simple orchestrations. It's really just her voice, these really grown-up lyric. Her voice was no longer double-tracked and gave it that sort of girl group sound. It was just pure, very, very raw recordings. And I think if you want to get a good sense of what she was about and what she could do, I think that's a fantastic album to look into. And
do you think that that's readily available kind of thing? Is that something that is in print at the moment, you think?
It is. For a long time, it wasn't. The only way you could get is to actually track down the LP. But after her passing, fortunately, it revived interest in her work, and not just her 60s pop work, but her entire career. And so that CD was actually released shortly after her passing, and it's available now pretty much anywhere.
Nice. Okay. One of the things that I was surprised at is that, Lesley continued to write and record and was continuing to stay relevant. And here it is, the late 70s, she gets involved in this project called Fame. And that was really kind of a surprise. And Lesley had a big part in that, too.
Absolutely. Her brother is a very, very talented man himself, was working in scoring motion pictures. And he was working on the film Fame, and he sort of saw it as a musical and presented that idea to the powers that be, and they really seemed to enjoy it. And he had this one particular song that he'd written the music to, but there were no lyrics. And so he passed it along to Lesley, who fell in love with it, and she thought, well, give me a few days and let me see what I can do with this. And there was something about the character in the film that connected with her, and she was able to write Out Here on My Own, which was nominated for an Academy Award, and itself was a hit single for Irene Cara. So, her Lesley's stamp is all over that movie as well.
And really, it's amazing. I mean, a lot of these artists from the 50s and 60s had trouble through the 70s, and then eventually there was this revival kind of thing. And, I think it's a natural thing. We all want to go back and relive our past, but unfortunately, we have this tendency, especially in America, to toss away our pop stars. Oh, okay, ABBA's huge, now we're going to kick them to the curb, whatever it might be. And that's got to be really difficult from an artist standpoint to have that just incredible adulation, and then suddenly, you can't get arrested. But really, Lesley was able to receive, she was able to enjoy a resurgence in her popularity late in life, and you talked about how she was able to do, some of these shows where she was able to not only play the oldies, but also able to play some of her, stuff that she wrote herself too.
Yeah, she was really smart in how she approached that. She wasn't crazy about the whole nostalgia bandwagon thing that was really big in the 70s and 80s. But she also knew that if she can get the fans in on the strength of her old hits, she can share some of the new material with them and tell them, look, I haven't disappeared. I've got this other wonderful stuff that I'm working on. So it's a really, really smart move for her to stay in the spotlight and continue to hold on to those old fans and attract new ones, which she successfully did. So she really saw that as a vessel for her to showcase some of her new work. And she was also very humble about everything. And she said, look, I can either deny that the 60s happened, or I can just embrace it as that was my career then. It's still my career now. And that was the attitude with which she just kind of jumped in.
And as we look at, you look at the charts now and how dominated they are by female artists, certainly people like Lesley Gore, people like Brenda Lee and Connie Francis. I mean, these are the ladies that paid the dues and paved the way for the fact that now I mean, you have females that are writing and recording their own material, and the charts is just full of it. Are we ever going to see Lesley Gore in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame kind of thing?
There's actually always been a huge push for it. I think it'll happen sooner than later, and I think a lot of the music that still hasn't been properly released either digitally or on CD, I think that's coming down the pike. As people have really reinvested in her career and they want to know more about her. Unfortunately, it took her passing to reinvigorate some of that interest, but I think it's there, and I think some good things are still coming along to keep that legacy going of hers.
Right, fantastic. So now to talk about you've written this book. You were a longtime fan. Is that it for you? You were just like, this is the one book? You have other books in the works kind of thing? Or?
I do. I'm working on a fiction novel right now that actually was always kind of there along with the biography, but I kept going back to her story just as new information would pop up. I would just get re-excited about that project. But I have a novel in the works, and because I so loved writing about the 50s and 60s, which is my favorite period of music, I also started another project about sort of that bizarre trend of the weepy death records.
Oh, wow.
Death records.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to, I've already spoken with Dickie Lee, who sang Patches. I've corresponded with the leader of the Shangri-Las, so there's been some fun interviews and some fun information coming along. So I'm hoping to finish the draft of that pretty soon.
Great, yeah. Well, I had Dickie Lee on the program last year, and he was such a gracious person. Such a
sweetheart.
Yep, really is. So that's good. Well, that's awesome. I can't wait to read. Those Teen Angel, and you can just go on and on and on. The whole list of those. So yeah, I don't know what the trend was, like why that was a big deal, but that would be an interesting book to read. So good luck on that. So
thank you. And it's funny you mentioned that's exactly the question I'm trying to answer in all these interviews is why?
Why? Right. Where has my baby been? Right, exactly, that kind of thing. So, well, cool. All right. Well, the new book is called You Don't Own Me, The Life and Times of Lesley Gore from Trevor Tolliver. It's available on Backbeat Books there. So, Trevor, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
You've been listening to Icon Fetch with Tony Peters. Want more great interviews? Head over to iconfetch.com. There, you'll find every interview we've ever done, plus CD reviews, This Day in Music, and a random album of the day. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter. Who is Tony going to interview next? It could be you. Send what you've got to Tony Peters. Icon Fetch, P.O. Box 292134, Dayton, Ohio 45429. Or email Tony at host@iconfetch.com. Until next time, this is Joe Kelly. Have a great day.